So today, guys, we are in our 5th week already of our series that we're starting the new year off with called Tudes, the Beatitudes. Throughout this series, we have been looking at new ways to think by Jesus. You could say we've been looking at some new attitudes. Jesus was giving them a new way to think about a lot of stuff in this sermon. And so far during this countercultural series, we've brought that up each week that this is a countercultural sermon. Throughout this countercultural series, we've been enlightened, or at least I hope we have been. The Beatitudes are found in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. The Sermon on the Mount is chapters 5 through 7. But this is the most countercultural sermon that Jesus ever gave in the Scriptures, and maybe one of the most countercultural sermons of all time. And it was countercultural because it was against what society thought was right, or what the norm was. And so in these Beatitudes, in the first 4, we have seen that the blessed are those who are poor in spirit, the blessed are those who mourn, the blessed are those who are gentle, or the blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. These are all things that the world would say are not blessed. People who hunger and thirst, people who are poor, people who mourn. But Jesus was countercultural in all aspects. He just did not go along with the way the world thought, because the world so often was just the opposite of God. And so here today, we're going to see it once again. In this 5th Beatitude, we see Jesus say that the blessed are the merciful. Once again, being merciful. It's not what our world, what our society would say gets you to the top. But Jesus was countercultural. When Jesus, the Son of God, was on earth as a human being, he made it clear that God's ways are often different than the world's ways. And so in our next Beatitude, Jesus said these words. He said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy." Today we're going to be looking at mercy. And I want to start off by sharing a story about Napoleon. Napoleon was one of the most successful generals of the French Revolutionary armies. He was emperor of France from 1804 to 1814. He's regarded as one of history's greatest military leaders. And the story I want to share goes like this. There was a mother who once approached Napoleon, seeking pardon for her son. But Napoleon replied that this young man had committed a certain offense twice, and justice demanded death for her son. And so she replies, "But I don't ask for justice. I plead for mercy." "But your son does not deserve mercy," Napoleon replied. "Sir," the woman cried, if it would not be mercy. So, "Sir," the woman replied, "it would not be mercy if he deserved it. Mercy is all I ask for." "Well then," Napoleon said, "I will have mercy." And he spared the woman's son. Now, I have no idea how factual the stories like that are when they're 200 years old and plus. It may or may not be 100% correct. Sometimes over the years, stories can be exaggerated a little bit more and more. But the part I want us to understand about mercy in this story is this. The mother was pleading for mercy. Napoleon said that he deserved death. That was what justice determined. He would die for his offenses. But the mother didn't want justice. She just wanted mercy. So to understand this a little bit better today, let's look quickly at this one question right now. What is mercy? If you look up a simple definition in a dictionary, you might see that mercy is the compassionate treatment of those in distress, especially when it is within someone's power to punish or harm that person. So think about that when it comes to Napoleon in that illustration. He could have brought death to this young man for his offenses, but he chose to have mercy. He chose instead to have compassion, even though this man was in the wrong. Mercy, it's one of God's great attributes that often gets dismissed. You know, mercy and grace those two attributes of God are often placed together, and rightfully so. They are amazing. Grace is God giving us what we do not deserve. Mercy, on the other hand, is God not giving us what we deserve. Think about that for a second. When God shows us mercy, He is not giving us what we deserve. See, we simply do not deserve His forgiveness. But in His mercy, He gives us forgiveness. So I want to take a brief look at God's mercy in the Old Testament. See, in the Old Testament, we see more of a God who punishes at times in the Old Testament. We see a God who wipes out all of mankind, sparing only Noah and his family early on. We see a God who wipes out all those living in the land of Canaan because He had promised that land to Abraham's descendants. One of the main reasons for that is because the land was so great. Another reason for that, maybe the greatest, is because those people living in the land of Canaan were wicked. They were evil, worshiping other gods. In the Old Testament, we see God punish even the Israelites at times. But we also see God leading the Israelites to victories in battle. And these battles, they were battles where God sent them to wipe out entire cities, one by one. So there's no doubt really that in the Old Testament we see a God that would punish those who were evil. He would punish those who sinned against Him. That included the Israelites. Now when you go back to the Old Testament, to the time that God delivered the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, we see a God of love. We see a God of grace. We see a God of mercy. But we also see a jealous God. We also see a God of wrath. Now, people don't like to think about God as being a jealous God or a God of wrath. But God describes Himself as a jealous God in Exodus. He's also described in Scriptures as a God of wrath. A lot of people don't like to think of God like that because we don't want a God like that. People want a God who is always loving only, never punishing. But we would be making God who He is not if we did that. Because God is a God who punishes, who judges. So in the Old Testament, we see a God who delivers the nation of Israel from being slaves for over 400 years in Egypt. He brought those 10 plagues on Egypt and on Pharaoh because Pharaoh's heart was so hard and he would not let the Israelites go. Finally, he lets the Israelites go, and after they left, shortly after, Pharaoh realizes he doesn't have any slaves anymore. So he goes after them. And immediately when the Israelites see Pharaoh and his army coming, they are afraid. They begin to grumble against Moses and against God. They grumbled against God on several occasions that we read about in the Old Testament while they were in that wilderness for 40 years. And yet God still brought them into the land of Canaan after they had sinned against Him over and over. And God would do that because He is not only a God of wrath and a jealous God, but He is a loving God. He is a merciful God. He's a God who cannot lie, a God who cannot break His promises. And so after God leads them across the Jordan River in the Old Testament to go into the promised land to take it over, it would be safe to assume that the Israelites would always follow and honor God, because God was clearly the one who led them. But to assume that would be wrong. The book of Joshua, it ends with the death of Joshua, but it also is at a time when the Israelites had taken over the land of Canaan, the promised land. Now their instructions from God were to wipe out all of those living in the land of Canaan. But the Israelites didn't follow these orders. They allowed some to live. And the reason God wanted them to wipe everyone out was because if they allowed these people to stay in that land, then the Israelites would be tempted to follow after their gods. Well, after Joshua in the Bible comes the book of Judges. In that book we see a God who would send judges to help lead Israel. And when these judges were doing their thing, the nation of Israel, they honored God. But often, in between these judges, when they didn't have a judge to lead them, the nation of Israel would turn away from God. Throughout the book of Judges, you read this phrase: everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So what does that tell us? It tells us that they weren't following God, they were following their own hearts. And in doing so, we read that they also began to worship false gods. You know, in a way, that phrase, everyone did what was right in their own eyes, makes me think a lot of America as a nation. That our society just says, do what feels good to you. Do whatever you think is right, as long as you're not breaking the law. But you want to know how great the love of God is? You want to know how great God's forgiveness and mercy is? Understand this, that even though God is a jealous God, even though He's a God of wrath, He loves His people, He loves His creation enough that He chooses to have mercy on us. He chooses to not give us what we deserve. Even though the Israelites would turn away from God over and over, God would eventually send someone to get them back in line, whether it was judges or whatever. That's the God we serve. They would get to the point where they didn't want judges. They wanted a king instead to rule over them. Why? Because they wanted to be like all the other nations around them. That's not what God wanted for them. All along, God wanted to be their ruler. God wanted to be their king. But being a God that loves and a God that allows free will, God gave them a king. And then another king. And another one. And so on down the line. But get this. While these kings, especially the first few for the most part, were ones who followed God closely, it wouldn't always be that way. The kingdom would become divided. And kings would begin to follow anything but the one true living God. And these kings in this nation of Israel, they did this over and over throughout the Old Testament. So God would try to help them. He would send prophets to help them. And often they wouldn't listen to these prophets either. And so you see, here's what I think we got to understand. Even in the Old Testament, where some people will think of God as being almost barbaric at times, wiping people out, what we truly see in the Old Testament is a God who loved His people enough to never give up on them. Even though they had turned their back on God over and over, there were times where He had to punish them. But He never gave up on them. He always loved them. He would forgive them. He would show mercy on them. Even in the Old Testament, when we see a God of wrath and a jealous God, we see a God of mercy. But then let's also look at God's mercy in the New Testament. In the New Testament, we see the mercy of God clearly. God sent His Son. Talk about not giving us what we deserve. See, we deserve for God to just really let us rot away with our sin-filled lives, the way that we live. That's not what we see God doing. We see that God continued with His promise to give us a way, mankind a way to have a right relationship with Him once again. See, we see in the New Testament where God would fulfill His promise to send a Savior into this world to die for the sins of the world. Think for just a bit about Peter, that great, wonderful disciple of Jesus who followed Him closely for a little over 3 years during Jesus' ministry. Peter was a rock. He was vocal. He was strong. And he was a close follower of Jesus. And what did Peter do when Jesus was arrested? He followed at a distance to see what would happen. But when people began to accuse Peter of being with Jesus, he lied and said he didn't even know the man. You want to see mercy in the New Testament? Think about what happens with Peter for the rest of his life. Peter, the rock, who denied even knowing Jesus, he could have been finished. God could have given up on him, and rightfully so. Because how could you expect a man who does that, who just denies that he even knows Jesus at all? How can you expect a man who does that to stand up in front of non-believers who could be ready to kill him and preach Jesus Christ? But what does God do with Peter? God uses Peter to be the first person to preach a gospel sermon. The good news that Jesus is the Christ in Acts chapter 2. On the very day the church began, God used Peter to get the church started, to get the church on its feet in Acts chapter 2. And about 3,000 people that day believed, repented, were baptized, and we are told they were added to the church that day. When God could have decided to have no mercy and give up on Peter, He instead had mercy. He didn't give Peter what he deserved. Instead, God put Peter in a place where it could either make or break him. Peter would be given this opportunity on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. And to be honest, he had a decision to make. He would either step up to the plate and preach Jesus, or he would give in to the temptation that says, I'm not the right one, or it's not for me. Peter chose to step up to the plate. And I say this stuff about Peter for this reason. God does the same with us today. It hasn't changed. While His methods, while maybe His styles of pursuing us can change and can be different, and reaching out to us can be different, understand this. God will pursue us. And He will use us to do His work if we allow it to happen. And you see, just like Peter, what we've done in the past doesn't matter. God's mercy is so great that He's given us today, which means we have the opportunity to make the most of this time. Every day we could be put in a situation like Peter that could be seen as a make or break time for us. And so we either make the most of that opportunity or we let it slide by. I can assure you of this, though. With those make or break times in life, when they come along, God will not let you fail if that's what He wants you to do. Just as He led the Israelites, just as He led Peter, God will lead us through a life that includes many struggles. We can either focus on the struggles, or we can let God lead us as we follow along. And for some, maybe it's time to step up to the plate in that way. Understand this, God has shown His mercy over and over, while we have failed Him over and over. Now you can see it in the Old Testament, you can see it in the New Testament, you can see it with us today. And now before we finish this today, I want us to look at one of the great parables of Jesus. It's what we call the parable of the unmerciful servant. And we're not going to go deep into this parable. You could have multiple different types of sermons, and you could go different ways with the sermon on this parable. But today we're just going to talk briefly about this one. This parable takes place in Matthew chapter 18, verses 23 through 35, if you wish to read it. I'm not going to read this parable today, but I am going to paraphrase this parable as we go along here for the next few minutes. But Jesus starts off this parable by talking about how the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who wants to settle accounts with his slaves. And he begins to settle the accounts. And he comes to one account where his slave owes him 10,000 talents. Now we read that in the scriptures. We just read it and we're like, okay, 10,000 talents. We don't think much about that or how much it is. Before we go any further, let's understand that this is a very large amount of money. 10,000 talents is said to be equal to this: 15 to 20 years of a day laborer's annual wages. Think about that. Whatever your yearly income is, great or small, imagine owing someone 15 to 20 years worth of your yearly income. How would you pay it off? It's difficult enough to pay off credit card debt. Imagine if it was this much. Well, let's just be blunt about it. We wouldn't be paying that amount off. 15 to 20 years worth of our income. It's not going to happen. Because with our income, we also have other bills we have to pay. It would be millions and millions of dollars, especially after interest would be added to it. I've read different numbers that people have figured out on this. You can read anything where what it would be worth in today's world. You could read anywhere from some people where they say it would be worth $12 million. Some people have even estimated $1 billion. No matter how you look at it, he owed a lot of money. And as you can guess, you then read in this parable that he was unable to repay it. And since he couldn't repay it, his master ordered him, his children, his wife to all be sold. Now, if that were to happen to us, we might do exactly what this slave does here. He falls to his knees and begins to beg his master to have patience, have mercy on him. Would you have compassion and mercy or not? Well, his master had compassion. His master had so much compassion that he forgave him of all of the debt. Now, can you imagine the sense of relief that the man must have felt? All that this man owed was forgiven. He was relieved of his debt, no longer concerned with having to pay it back. Of course, this man would go on with a huge smile on his face and with the same type of compassion that he had been given, wouldn't he? That's not what we read. Instead, we read that this man then goes out and he finds one of his fellow slaves who owes him 100 denarii. Now, a denarius, one of those, is worth a day's wage. So, this man owes him 100 days worth of pay. That's still a lot of money, but it's not 15 to 20 years worth of wages. And you would think that he would immediately have compassion on this guy. Instead, he grabs him, he begins to choke him, and he demands that he pay him back everything he owes him. The man falls to the ground begging for mercy, just like he had with the master. But there was no compassion here. He instead has the man thrown in prison. The man who had been shown a great deal of compassion and mercy was unwilling to have compassion and mercy on others. And while this was taking place, their fellow slaves see it happening. They report to their master. So their master is so upset with this man that he calls him back in. He calls him wicked. He reminds him of how he had relieved him of his debt. And he asks him this question in Matthew 18:33. He says, "Should you not also have had mercy on your fellow slave in the same way that I had mercy on you?" There's that word we're thinking about, mercy. The master wants to know why he couldn't show mercy, just like mercy had been shown to him. And since he didn't have mercy, the master handed him over to be tortured. And then Jesus finished the parable off this way in the 35th verse. He says, "My heavenly Father will also do the same to you if each of you does not forgive his brother from your heart." This whole parable came about because Peter asked Jesus how often they should forgive someone when they sin against them. And Jesus gave this parable as a response. A parable with the meaning that says, just as God has forgiven us, we also ought to forgive. A parable that says, just as God has had mercy on us, we also ought to have mercy. That's a lot of forgiveness and mercy we have to do in life, isn't it? But Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy." See, we've seen a God full of mercy from the Old Testament to the New Testament, even to us today. And if we truly look deep, we can find time after time where God has not given us what we deserve, because we serve a God of mercy. God could have done to us like this second man did to the second slave, where he demanded his payment and had thrown in prison. But God instead acted like the master. He wipes our slate free. He relieves us of our debt because our debt was paid in full by His Son, Jesus Christ. So maybe there's something in your life right now, or someone that needs to be shown mercy. The thing is, Jesus doesn't teach us, He doesn't tell us to only show mercy and forgiveness for those who give it to us. He says we're to have that type of mercy and forgiveness that God the Father has shown towards His creation. So God took action. And God showed mercy on us by sending His Son. Are we taking action to show mercy on those who have sinned against us as well? One of the hardest things for us to do sometimes. But blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. We're going to sing a hymn of invitation here this morning. If you've never given your life to Jesus Christ, if you've never put your faith in Jesus Christ, if you've never trusted Him to make Him Lord of your life, if you've never repented to be willing to make Jesus Lord of your life and to turn away from sin, if you've never confessed Him and been immersed in the waters of baptism for the forgiveness of your sins, you have that opportunity to do that. We're going to stand and we're going to sing a hymn of invitation this morning. We're going to sing the first and last verses of song number 204, Jesus Paid It All.